Hello students, this is the first of our Big Idea lectures. During each module, we'll check in on our big idea weekly. We're starting with kind of three big ideas: landscape, nature, and history. Today, I want to get you started thinking about those topics. Your readings of Simon Schama's critical work on landscape in British history and literature, and of Edmund Waller's topographical poem on St. James's Park, which is a famous spot in London, will deepen these ideas and give you a chance to start practicing your own critical work. So let's get started here. Why these three terms? You're going to see that landscape, nation, and history all straddle a line between inside and outside. We may think of these three things as existing outside of us as objects that we can study, but we're going to learn to complicate that matter and think about how they can also be ways of thinking. So that's the first point. These terms are connected because they move between the objective and the subjective world. That's very precisely the space of interpretation within which I want you to work. So what's at stake here? Why should we care about this? Well, first, this kind of division between the forms of the world and the ways in which we think about the world is important to grasp because it lets us understand history in a more profound way. Separating the world from our concepts about the world also lets us be more effective actors in our own historical moments. We're effectively studying a division that was very important in the 18th century and which is still important for our time. I'm talking about the division between nature and culture. Hit the pause button and take a moment to think about where in your life you've seen that division. I want to show you some more examples of how that divide works and how it breaks down and stops working. So our slightly more narrow question for today is, what does a landscape mean? That might seem like a weird question. How can a landscape mean something? Let's explore it and see. So first, look at this image on your screen. You might recognize this as a natural scene, the kind of thing we're accustomed to calling a landscape. There's nothing man-made here, and you might be tempted to say it doesn't mean anything. However, if we zoom out, we'll see something different. What we're actually looking at is a painting by the French surrealist René Magritte that perfectly juxtaposes the natural and the artificial. So just to say for a second, Magritte is a 20th century French painter. He's not somebody directly associated with our class, but he's really good for illustrating this concept of landscape. Sometimes what we think is most natural is actually carefully constructed. So at first, when we were looking at that painting up close, we thought we were looking at nature. But Magritte is here to remind us that we never have an unmediated experience of anything, particularly of nature. And here's how he explains that. So Schama is going to talk about Magritte, and here's what he says. We see the world as being outside ourselves, even though it's only a mental representation of what we experience on the inside. What lies beyond the window pane of our apprehension, says Magritte, needs a design before we can properly discern its form, let alone derive pleasure from its perception. The point here is that we stand to benefit from thinking about the role of design in our perceptions. This week, we're going to start thinking about how some Restoration-era poets used their depictions of nature to make specific political meanings. Just in case that seems far-fetched, let's look at some images of landscapes that have political meanings. You may not be familiar with the White Cliffs of Dover, but this is a spot that has a huge national meaning for English people. So this is the coast of England that faces France, and it's a famous spot, and it's a symbol of their country. So a landscape can become a symbol of nationalism. How about this? This is the Shire from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. This is where the hobbits live, Bilbo and Frodo and the rest. So you might think for just a minute about the emotional and ideological meanings of this place where hobbits live. You know, it's beautiful nature, it's simple, it's pure, it's something we're supposed to think is somehow better than other places. So there are political meanings bound up there too. Let's stick with the Hobbit for a minute. How's the landscape of Mount Doom different from the landscape of the Shire? Both of these landscapes are imbued with a great deal of meaning, and they tell us something. So this is a sort of expressionistic side of landscape. Just to show you that images of nature are not without a history, here is a painting by a famous 18th century painter from England, Joseph Wright of Derby. So here we're actually in our period for once. So clearly, Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings films, is working within a landscape tradition that traces back to the 18th century. I mean, look at this. Mount Doom, Joseph Wright of Derby. So, so far we've looked at landscapes to which humans have attributed meanings through convention. That's the way this usually works, right? We have a landscape, we look at it and we say, now that's a symbol of our country, or now that's something that tells us what nature is supposed to be like. We don't always go this way. Sometimes we do this. You might think of this as a reversal of the usual process of adding meaning to a landscape. We chiseled the politics right into the landscape in this case. Let's shift gears here and talk about our second term. What is a nation? You know, this is another term, kind of like landscape, that we might think of as being without a history. It's easy to take it for granted, but before the 18th century, there wasn't really an idea of a collection of people who could be called a nation. There were kingdoms and city-states and a number of other kinds of organizations, but the peculiar qualities of the nation are an historical product of the era we're studying. So here's a dictionary definition of nation. And this is probably what you're pretty familiar with. The idea is it's a group of people, right? An aggregate of communities and individuals that are somehow distinct, right, from other people around them. This also overlaps with the idea of state, is what we get here. You know, so the politics and the people sort of go together. What's important about this, though, is that it emphasizes the actual group of people. The nation is the people. Let's look at a different definition. Benedict Anderson has his idea of imagined communities. And so his definition of a nation is that it's a group of people who belong to this group that they all see because they all imagine themselves to be a part of it. It's a group that's bigger than a group of people that you'll ever interact with. So, for instance, we can feel like we're members of an American nation somehow, even though there are tons of Americans we never interact with. You might even feel like you're part of the Javelina nation without, for all that, having to interact with all the people who are here on campus or elsewhere that are also part of that group. So it addresses population growth, this idea of the imagined community. The nation is too big for us all to meet each other, and this is something that we'll see happening in 18th century Britain, this population boom. Anderson wants us to think of the nation as something imagined, which makes it easier to understand how something like a poem helps us create it. So while we're at it, you might pause and think for a few moments about how cultural artifacts create the nation we live in now, and how the meaning of those artifacts change over time. So think about something like a song like Born in the USA, that Bruce Springsteen song. You know, it starts out as a critique of the fate of our military veterans in the post-Vietnam era. But it also then morphed into a campaign song for Ronald Reagan. So he repurposed it and used it for something else entirely to get you thinking about America in a different way. And now Donald Trump is using it to taunt Ted Cruz with his birther allegations. In our class, we'll see how literature helped define the nation in the 18th century England. Okay, so that's part one of our first big idea, landscape, nation, and history. I ask that you keep these ideas in mind as you read Schama and Waller next week, and we'll check in with these ideas again next week.